Welcome to Behind the Data. I'm Jeff Krimmel, founder of Krimmel Strategy Group. Each week, I take you behind the energy market analysis I'm publishing online, what surprised me, what I left out, and what I'm still thinking about. Let's get into it. The first post this week was about the petrochemicals industry. I spoke with CNBC, a reporter at CNBC, about the Iran war-driven impact on petrochemicals. Really, the opportunity to participate in the article was about all the ways that the Iran war is driving inflation across the economy and what the ultimate impact will be for consumers. I responded to the journalist by saying there's effectively three pathways that I'm paying attention to that we see this disruption manifest in the wider economy. The first one is higher oil prices disrupt gasoline prices, create higher gasoline prices. That, of course, lands immediately with consumers in terms of the price they're paying at the tank. The second pathway is higher oil prices lead to higher diesel prices. And these higher diesel prices propagate through the economy, largely through freight and transportation sectors. And so that hits a wider swath of the economy. And on the diesel side, the demand is less elastic. So as diesel prices spike, it's not like you see less freight and less transportation across the economy. A lot of that stuff is contracted in advance. And so those higher diesel prices are just embedded in the freight and transportation sectors. And those then get carried into prices for finished goods that end consumers ultimately buy. The third pathway is through petrochemicals, right? So the first pathway was gasoline. The second pathway was diesel. Those are both fuels. This third pathway is petrochemicals, which is a materials pathway. And here is where you get the increasing price of petrochemical feedstocks that then mean higher prices for a lot of the plastics that we're familiar with. So a lot of the stuff that food and beverage is packaged in and that personal hygiene products are packaged in and home cleaning products, just the most of the stuff that people buy day to day is largely packaged directly or indirectly in some form of plastic, and all of those prices go up as the feedstock prices go up that petrochemical facilities use to produce these products on the back end. So this article was about the petrochemicals piece specifically, but when I was framing it up to the journalist, I wanted him to understand, here's the three mechanisms that we see this price disruption propagate through the global economy around, and we can discuss the petrochemicals piece. So we talked a bit about when you think about the petrochemicals sector globally, there are really two sectors that you're thinking through. One exists largely in Asia, and that is a petrochemical sector that whose feedstock is primarily naphtha, which is a liquid product that you get through the petroleum refining process. And that naphtha, when you crack it and start to produce the petrochemicals on the back end, you get a wide array of petrochemicals. You get ethylene and propylene and aromatics and a whole bunch of products that you could that will wind up in different products across the economy. The other element of the petrochemicals industry is the one that largely exists in the U.S. And rather than using naphtha, the liquid feedstock, it uses ethane, which is a gas feedstock. And mostly what you get on the back end is ethylene of that. So it's a much narrower product space that you exist in the petrochemicals sector here in the U.S. So when you have the crude oil disruptions that you see in the Strait of Hormuz, much of the naphtha that's coming out of the Strait of Hormuz, that for the oil that's already been refined, that naphtha is going to Asia Pacific for petrochemical feedstock. And that feedstock is much less available, just like the crude oil is much less available. And so you see these Asian petrochemical facilities that are implementing force majeure events. There's something like over 30 of these have been tracked over the past few weeks. And in some cases, petrochemical facilities are shutting down. In other cases, petrochemical facilities are being ramped back to their minimum operating throughput levels. And so you see, as a result, much less petrochemical products coming out the other end of these facilities. That, in time, manifests in higher materials prices that we see throughout the economy. So that was the mechanisms that we discussed in the CNBC piece. The why to even go in that direction was I got this media inquiry from CNBC about petrochemicals. And this one was very interesting because I've spoken with a lot of media members about the oil the sector around gasoline, the immediate implications that you're seeing there. Petrochemicals is a piece that in many ways touches many more parts of the economy than just gasoline does. But it's not very well understood. The effects that happen on the petrochemical side are much less immediate than the effects that you see with gasoline. Also, the effects that happen on the petrochemicals side are much harder to put your fingers on and trace back immediately to oil supply disruptions and oil price spikes. Whereas when the price at the pump goes up with gasoline, most people immediately tie that back to the headlines that they're reading about oil. And so I really wanted to participate here because this was a chance for the general public to better understand how oil and gas works broadly. And then you have this petrochemicals piece. And while we didn't go into it with CNBC, the petrochemicals piece is important for countless reasons, but one that keeps showing up here with the talks that I've been giving publicly is when you look at what will happen to oil demand going out to 2050. There's a lot of debate. There's a lot of uncertainty about how much higher does oil demand actually grow from here, and how long will that growth trajectory last. And once global oil demand stops growing, how long does it plateau, and then how quickly does it fall off on the other side? You'll see a wide range of forecasts that vary considerably what happens with global oil demand out to 2050. One thing that almost all of these oil forecasts share is the idea that petrochemicals is going to be an increasingly important source of global oil demand in the decades ahead. Different sources have different ideas about how quickly will the world displace gasoline, how quickly will it displace diesel, how quickly will it displace jet fuel. But almost no one thinks that the petrochemicals piece will get displaced as quickly as any of the liquid fuels components will be. So if you are very bullish on oil demand out to 2050, you almost certainly have a very bullish look about what happens with petrochemicals. And so knowing that so many energy decisions going forward are predicated in some sense on what happens to oil demand out to 2050, the better we all understand and appreciate what's happening on the petrochemical side, the better able we are to understand what happens to our energy systems out to 2050. So that was another bit that made me excited to talk about petrochemicals with the CNBC journalist, because that petrochemicals piece just shows up in a lot more energy conversations. It will continue to show up in more energy conversations going forward. And so it's something that I really wanted to get involved with, and really enjoyed the conversation that I had, and was glad that those insights showed up in the published piece that was published this weekend. Another piece that I want to talk about here was something I wrote about on LinkedIn about how our energy conversation has moved from a focus on sustainability, which is where it was, say, 2020 through 2022, to a conversation on affordability, 2023 through 2025, when you got the inflation coming out of the recovery for the pandemic. And now, in 2026, we're starting to have a lot more of the energy conversation focus on energy security, with the Iran war figuring prominently in that part of the transition. So why did I want to write about this piece? It's that this idea of how our energy conversation is evolving has popped in my head routinely over the past several months as I give more talks. A lot of the talks that I give about energy, I make sure that I start with a longer range view of where energy is today, where we might imagine it could go in the decades ahead. And once we have some footing around how we expect the energy systems to evolve in the decades ahead, then we can trace back to what we expect to happen in the near term. And I think it's that connectivity between what's happening in the near term and how this should feed into what's happening in the longer term that helps us all process more, just gives us more context and more perspective around how we should understand and make decisions in what's happening here in the near term. So the idea of how our energy conversation is evolving is something I think about routinely, but particularly with the Iran war. And as we're hearing more conversations about how energy consumers are thinking about at the national level, how political leaders are thinking about how to position their energy systems, and how they're navigating around these oil and gas and LNG supply disruptions and these price spikes that are happening on the other end. I believe it's even more important that we all really grapple with this energy conversation that we're having, and how each of these three phases of the energy conversation have been hyper-specific around one element. And it becomes clear the more you're involved in the energy conversation, the more you track the energy conversation, These three pieces, sustainability, affordability, security, there's a trilemma here. There's a connection that exists across these three. And we need to appreciate the balance, the tension that exists across those three. If we try to make decisions focused almost exclusively on any one of these three, we will get to suboptimal outcomes. There is a balance across all three. These different energy technologies that a lot of folks like to get into debating whether we should go with energy technology A versus B and how to classify them and which political parties align most strongly with some versus the other. And it can become very emotional and very tribal and very quickly counterproductive. But to have a more productive energy conversation, I think it's helpful to understand this tension that exists across these three dimensions. And we're now swinging between these three. And my hope is, now that we're having this intense focus on security, as we make more progress here, as we get a resolution to what's happening in Iran, in the Middle East, it will become increasingly clear that we can't just focus exclusively on sustainability. We cannot just focus exclusively on affordability. We cannot focus exclusively on security. It will be a balance between these three that gets us toward the decisions that help us optimize this global footprint. Going forward, energy demand is growing. It's even more important that the world get access to more and more sources of energy, to greater and greater volumes of energy. And I am hopeful that our energy conversation is evolving in this more nuanced, more comprehensive direction. And that's a really important piece for us to get to the kinds of outcomes that we need in order for the human population to thrive amidst some really challenging energy-focused elements of our economy, of just the broader way that our societies are organized, that our politics are implemented within, getting clarity and perspective and more rationality around how we want to handle and discuss and pursue this energy piece will be increasingly valuable. So that's all been on my mind, and seeing how the war has evolved and what the conversation looks like, it just felt like a good time to put that piece together, which is what I did this past week. The third piece that I wanted to highlight here was a piece that I wrote about an explosion and a fire that happened at Valero's Port Arthur refinery. And that one hit close to home because before I launched KSG in January of 2024, my last corporate role was at a company called Pinnacle, an industrial reliability solutions company. And I became the chief strategy officer at Pinnacle. And Pinnacle serves the petroleum refining community intensely. It's where the company got its start. It's where an enormous amount of activity happens today. There's great innovation that's happening in the world of industrial reliability focused on petroleum refineries. And so it's an area that I paid a lot of attention to when I was at Pinnacle. And this story here with the Port Arthur refinery fire and explosion just brought back a lot of those memories about just how hard the industrial reliability challenge is. When you don't live in that space, it's easy to sit from a distance and think, we've been working with hydrocarbons for 150 years at this point. Why is it so difficult to keep them from catching on fire and leaking and spilling and ultimately exploding? And it's not an entirely unreasonable frustration to have. And the technical elements of pursuing and protecting and propagating this notion of industrial reliability are profound. It's just really tough. We're dealing with large volumes of hydrocarbons that we're processing at incredible temperatures and incredible pressures. They are traveling over huge facilities. And it's frankly just really tough to completely understand what all is happening simultaneously, what the real-time risk profile looks like. And knowing we have a limited amount of resources with which to intervene in these facilities, how do we with confidence steer these resources accordingly? To be clear, our tools to help solve this problem are getting better every single day. There are a huge number of practitioners that are helping operators of petroleum refineries to get more clarity, to develop more confidence, to develop a more comprehensive data-driven view of what's happening in these refineries. And that's promising. It's encouraging that there's a lot of innovation and a lot of dedication that's happening there. It's something I got to see firsthand that was very exciting and interesting, challenging, rewarding to be a part of. So this story just landed personally with me, given where I'd spent so much of my time when I was there at Pinnacle. And then you also just had the real world impact of the story, that the Port Arthur refinery is the 9th largest refinery in the U.S. And so when this refinery goes offline, the world feels that there's an impact to this. This is not a small-scale facility that's going offline for some short period of time. And so this outage would matter at any point in time, but it matters more right now given what's happening with the Iran war, that we have so much supply of oil and finished petroleum products around the world that's gone offline. And so we need every operating asset that is available and that has safe access to markets. We need all of those assets to function as well as they possibly can. And so right now, to have that fire and that explosion is some of the worst timing imaginable. It is great news that, at least based on the reporting that I'd seen, there were no injuries, no fatalities, that we were spared the worst safety outcomes, which is a real blessing. And yet there are real operational outcomes that come with enormous pain and economic consequence, and that's part of what we're going to deal with in the aftermath of what happened at Valero's Port Arthur refinery. So that was a view behind some of the pieces that I wrote about in LinkedIn and why those pieces caught my attention and how I was processing it. I was trying to put those pieces together. If this is the kind of information and behind-the-scenes look behind this data view that you enjoy, then I encourage you to keep listening. I'll keep doing one of these episodes each week between 15 and 20 minutes long. I appreciate you taking the time to listen, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one.